Deep beneath the sprawling estate of Sean Diddy Combs, a labyrinth of tunnels winds through the earth, a relic of secrecy and opulence few knew existed. It was said that the tunnels were built during the height of Diddy's career, a concealed network connecting his mansion to hidden storage rooms, music studios, and underground passageways designed for escape. For years, the tunnels remained shrouded in mystery, a footnote in urban legend. But for one man, Diddy's attorney, Charles "Chuck" Sullivan, those tunnels became a harrowing chapter of his life, a discovery that still haunts him. Before we start, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more updates. Chuck was a seasoned attorney, renowned for his discretion and his ironclad defense strategies. He had weathered the chaos of celebrity clients, their scandals, and their demands, but nothing prepared him for what awaited in the darkness beneath Diddy's estate. It all began with an unexpected phone call late one night. Diddy, uncharacteristically somber, instructed Chuck to oversee the cleanup and documentation of his subterranean vaults. A recent flood had compromised part of the structure, and Diddy wanted every inch inspected before restoration. Chuck arrived at the estate early the next morning, accompanied by a small team of archivists and contractors. He expected to encounter waterlogged records, damaged memorabilia, and perhaps a few oddities from Diddy's eclectic collection. What he found instead would unravel his sense of reason and tether him to nightmares he could never fully escape. The entrance to the tunnels was concealed beneath the grand staircase of Diddy's mansion. A steel door, disguised to blend seamlessly with the floorboards, groaned as it opened. Chuck descended the narrow staircase, the air growing cooler and heavier with each step. The tunnels were wider than he imagined, their walls reinforced with concrete and lined with recessed lighting that flickered ominously. The group pressed forward, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The first few chambers were unremarkable, climate-controlled vaults filled with gold records, rare vinyl, and racks of designer clothing. Then they entered a room that immediately shifted the tone of the exploration. It was larger than the others, with high ceilings and shelves crammed with old photographs, videotapes, and journals. At the center of the room stood a peculiar statue, its features obscured by years of dust. The figure depicted was human-like but grotesquely exaggerated, its eyes hollow and wide, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Chuck felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at it, the others murmuring uneasily. "Let's keep moving," Chuck instructed, masking his unease. Yet the atmosphere seemed to darken with every turn. In the next chamber, they found a collection of locked trunks. One of the contractors pried open the first trunk, revealing stacks of old notebooks. Chuck flipped through the pages, his breath catching as he read the scrawled handwriting. They weren't Diddy's notes, nor did they appear to belong to anyone he recognized. The pages detailed cryptic symbols, strange rituals, and references to figures Chuck had only encountered in esoteric folklore. A sense of dread began to claw at him. The deeper they went, the more inexplicable their findings became. In one room, they uncovered rows of mannequins dressed in garments that seemed centuries old. Their faces were painted with disturbing accuracy, each expression frozen in an unsettling tableau of joy, grief, or terror. Another chamber contained a collection of mirrors, their surfaces covered with black drapes. A contractor pulled one drape aside, and for a fleeting moment, Chuck thought he saw movement in the reflection, something that shouldn't have been there. He barked at the team to leave the mirrors untouched. Hours passed, and the sense of dread grew heavier. They reached a section of the tunnels where the lights no longer functioned. Armed with flashlights, they pressed forward, though several of the team members began voicing their discomfort. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic odor. Chuck noticed scratch marks along the walls as though something had clawed at the concrete. His rational mind dismissed them as wear and tear, but his instincts screamed otherwise. In the furthest chamber, they found a door unlike any they had encountered. It was ornate, crafted from dark wood and etched with symbols that seemed to writhe under the flashlight beams. Chuck hesitated before pushing it open, a growing part of him wishing they had stopped earlier. What lay beyond that door would cement the tunnels as a source of his deepest fears. The room was vast and circular, its walls adorned with murals that depicted unsettling scenes, shadowy figures gathered in ceremonies, faces contorted in ecstasy and agony. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested an object that defied description. It was small, black and irregularly shaped, as though it had been carved by no earthly tool. The moment Chuck set eyes on it, he felt an inexplicable wave of nausea and vertigo. One of the contractors reached out to touch it, but Chuck barked at him to stop. "This isn't some artifact to catalog," Chuck snapped. "We need to leave." The team seemed relieved to retreat, but their journey back to the surface felt agonizingly slow. The tunnels, once merely ominous, now felt suffocating. Chuck kept glancing over his shoulder, convinced that something was following them. Though every time he turned, the passage was empty. Once they emerged into the daylight, Chuck felt an overwhelming urge to distance himself from the estate. He made arrangements for the tunnels to be sealed indefinitely, fabricating a story about structural instability. He never shared the details of what they found with Diddy, nor did he include them in his official report. But the discovery gnawed at him. Over the following weeks, Chuck began experiencing vivid nightmares. He dreamed of the murals, the grotesque statue, and the object on the pedestal. In his dreams, the shadowy figures moved, their hollow eyes fixing on him. He awoke drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed him from the tunnels. The nightmare soon seeped into his waking life. Chuck became paranoid, convinced that he was being watched. He started noticing fleeting shadows in the corners of rooms, strange whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. His colleagues and family grew concerned, but he couldn't bring himself to share the truth. How could he explain that an object beneath Diddy's estate had opened a door to something incomprehensible? Months later, Chuck received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the circular chamber and the pedestal. The object was gone. Beneath the photo, a single line was scrawled, "It's awake." Chuck quit his practice shortly after, retreating from public life. He became a recluse, haunted by the discovery and its implications. He often wondered if Diddy had known about the tunnel's true nature, or if they had been an inheritance from a previous owner. He considered contacting his former client, but ultimately decided against it. Some questions were better left unanswered. Years passed, but the memories of that day never faded. Every now and then, Chuck would hear a story on the news, an unexplained event, a strange disappearance, and his mind would drift back to the tunnels. He would wonder if the object had anything to do with it, if his decision to leave it untouched had spared or doomed the world. In his quiet moments, Chuck often sat by his window staring into the night. Sometimes in the silence, he thought he heard faint whispers, just like those in the tunnels. They reminded him that while he had left the tunnels behind, they had never truly let him go. Chuck's retreat from public life did little to quell the specters that clung to him after his fateful descent into the tunnels. The longer he sat in his self-imposed exile, the more he began to unravel the threads of what he had encountered. He took to studying esoteric texts, folklore, and histories of the occult, all in search of some understanding, though a part of him dreaded what he might find. What plagued him most wasn't just the discovery of the object or the oppressive murals in the tunnels, it was the sense that the experience had altered him. Even alone in his study, buried under tomes that smelled of dust and ancient decay, he often felt a presence just outside his periphery. The whispers persisted, subtle at first, growing louder in moments of silence. Sometimes they sounded like pleading voices. At other times, they carried the cadence of laughter, mocking and cold. He began to dread the quiet hours of the night, yet he couldn't escape them. Sleep came fitfully and only in fits of exhaustion. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Chuck sat at his desk, staring at a book he could not bring himself to open. The title, The Abyssal Echoes, was embossed in gold on a fraying leather cover. He'd acquired it from a rare bookstore in upstate New York after mentioning his interest to an overly eager proprietor. The man's eyes had lit up at Chuck's inquiry, almost as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask about this particular volume. Now, weeks later, it sat unopened, radiating an unsettling aura of its own. Chuck had convinced himself he wasn't afraid to read it, but the truth gnawed at him. The storm intensified, thunder rattling the windows. As Chuck reached for the book, a sharp knock echoed from his front door. He froze. It was nearly midnight, and he wasn't expecting visitors. His home, tucked away in a rural part of Connecticut, wasn't the kind of place anyone stumbled upon accidentally. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent and deliberate. Grabbing the revolver he kept in his desk drawer, Chuck moved cautiously to the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw nothing but darkness. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the steps. Swallowing his unease, he opened the door a crack. No one was there. He stepped outside, the cold rain soaking through his slippers and robe almost instantly. He scanned the empty driveway, the trees lining his property swaying violently in the wind. Then he saw it. A package, neatly wrapped in brown paper, sitting at the base of the steps. It hadn't been there earlier. Chuck stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and retreating inside. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. Inside was a single object, a mirror, small enough to fit in his palm, with a silver frame intricately etched with symbols that were all too familiar. They matched the ones on the door deep within Diddy's tunnels. His stomach churned as he turned the mirror over, half expecting to see some grotesque reflection staring back at him. But the surface was fogged, obscured as if the glass had been breathing. He placed the mirror face down on his desk and reached for the phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad. Who would he call? The police? They'd think he was insane. Did he? No, the idea of involving him felt like a mistake. After all, Chuck still couldn't be sure whether his former client had been ignorant of the tunnel's secrets or complicit in them. Before he could decide, the phone rang. Chuck nearly dropped it in surprise. The screen showed an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. A voice crackled on the other end, distorted as if coming from an ancient, damaged speaker. "You looked where you shouldn't have." Chuck's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. "You've seen it. You felt it. Now it's seen you." The line went dead. For a long time, Chuck sat frozen in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear. When he finally lowered it, he realized his hands were shaking so violently that he could barely set it down. His gaze drifted back to the mirror. It was upright now, though he was certain he had left it face down. His own pale reflection stared back at him, distorted and warped as though the glass were rippling. That night marked a turning point. The whispers in Chuck's mind became louder, more coherent. They no longer hid in the quiet recesses of his thoughts, but instead demanded his attention. They spoke in languages he couldn't identify, their words scraping against his sanity like nails on a chalkboard. The shadows he'd once glimpsed at the edges of his vision grew bolder, lingering longer, their forms more distinct. They weren't human, at least not entirely. Their limbs stretched and twisted unnaturally, their heads tilted at impossible angles. Chuck tried to resist their pull, to drown them out with alcohol and distraction, but no amount of whiskey or late-night television could banish them. He began to fear the darkness itself, leaving every light in his home on at all hours. Yet even in the light he could feel their presence, their invisible hands pressing against his shoulders, their breath warm and fetid against his neck. Desperate for answers, Chuck returned to the book, The Abyssal Echoes. This time he forced himself to open it. The pages were brittle and yellowed, the text written in cramped, spidery handwriting. The book spoke of ancient forces, entities that existed beyond human comprehension. They weren't gods or demons, at least not in the traditional sense, but beings of immense power and malice, existing in dimensions parallel to our own. The symbols he had seen on the door and the mirror appeared frequently, described as sigils of summoning and binding. Chuck found himself drawn to a chapter about artifacts, objects imbued with a fragment of these entities' essence. The book warned that such artifacts acted as conduits, bridges between their world and ours. Those who came into contact with them often became marked, their lives unraveling as the entity's influence seeped into their reality. He slammed the book shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Was that what the object in Diddy's tunnels had been? An artifact? And if so, why had it been there? The questions were endless, their answers elusive and terrifying. Chuck was no longer certain whether he had been a victim of circumstance, or if some force had guided him to the tunnels that day, knowing he would be drawn to their secrets. In the weeks that followed, Chuck's paranoia reached unbearable levels. He boarded up his windows, convinced that the shadows outside were more than just tricks of the light. He avoided mirrors entirely, covering them with cloths or smashing them outright. Yet no matter what precautions he took, the entities persisted. His reflection appeared in places it shouldn't, distorted, watching him with a knowing grin that wasn't his own. He started hearing his name whispered in the wind, spoken in voices he didn't recognize. Then one night he awoke to find himself standing at his desk, the strange mirror from the package clutched in his hands. He had no memory of leaving his bed. The mirror's surface was no longer fogged. It was clear now, its reflection impossibly deep, as though it were a window into another realm. He stared into it, transfixed. Shadows writhed within, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them stepped closer, its featureless face pressing against the glass. Chuck screamed and hurled the mirror across the room. It shattered against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. But as he stood there, panting, he realized the whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, almost triumphant. The shadows in the room lengthened, stretching toward him like grasping hands. In an act of desperation, Chuck packed a bag and fled his home. He drove aimlessly through the night, his headlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. But no matter how far he drove, the whispers followed. The shadows flickered in his rearview mirror, and the feeling of being watched never left him. Eventually, he found himself at a seedy motel on the outskirts of a small town. He checked in under a false name, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. The room was sparse and cold, the walls thin enough to hear the muffled conversations of his neighbors. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faded floral wallpaper, trying to collect his thoughts. It was there, in that dingy motel room, that Chuck realized the truth. The entities weren't just haunting him, they were breaking him, eroding his sense of self piece by piece. They thrived on fear, on the unraveling of the mind. He was their conduit now, their bridge to this world. As dawn broke, Chuck made a decision. He couldn't outrun them, but perhaps he could stop them. He reached for the revolver in his bag, his hands steady for the first time in weeks. If the entities needed him as their connection, then severing that connection might be his only option. Yet, as he raised the gun, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. The last thing Chuck saw before pulling the trigger was his reflection in the cracked motel mirror, grinning, triumphant, and no longer his own. The aftermath of Chuck's final act did not bring the closure he had sought. The small-town motel where his body was found became the epicenter of whispered rumors, the kind of stories that linger in hushed conversations in shadowy corners. The local authorities ruled his death a clear suicide. There was no ambiguity in the single gunshot wound, no evidence to suggest otherwise. Yet those who entered the room to recover his body couldn't shake the sensation that something else had been there, watching them from the periphery just out of sight. The room itself seemed off, even after the coroner removed Chuck's remains. Motel staff refused to enter it, complaining of an unshakable chill that seemed to permeate the air. The housekeeper tasked with cleaning it quit abruptly after attempting to scrub away a dark stain on the wall behind the bed, claiming that it moved beneath her sponge like an oil slick on water. She swore she heard faint laughter as she fled the room. Within weeks, the motel owner sealed the room entirely, citing structural issues as the official reason. Locals, however, shared different theories. Some claimed they saw shadows moving behind the drawn curtains at night, though the room had been locked and unoccupied. Others swore they heard voices when walking past it, low guttural whispers that sent chills down their spines. Stranger still were the events that began to plague those who had any contact with Chuck's belongings. The police officer who cataloged his possessions reported vivid nightmares that left him drenched in sweat. He dreamed of twisting tunnels that seemed to stretch infinitely, their walls clawed and bleeding, and of a black pulsating object that radiated malice. He resigned within the month, his mental health rapidly deteriorating. The broken mirror Chuck had thrown across the room was another source of contention. The motel manager attempted to discard the shards, but they seemed to reappear inexplicably, scattered across the floor each morning, when the mirror fragments were finally removed and destroyed. The strange occurrences in the room only grew worse. Guests staying in adjacent rooms began reporting oppressive feelings of dread, as though an unseen force were pressing down on their chests. One man described the sensation as being watched by something ancient. Despite these events, no definitive answers emerged. Chuck's death remained an enigma, his torment a dark secret that few dared to explore. The tunnels beneath Diddy's estate, now sealed, seemed to wait in silence, an ancient, brooding presence biding its time. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, What are your thoughts on what Diddy's attorney discovered in the tunnels? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.